Hello, fourth and fifth grade artists. Today we're going to take a quick look at starting our still life and getting our still life drawn. This is really a very similar process to what you did when you did your contour shoes, where you're looking for the inlines and outlines of an object to really make it as detailed and carefully drawn as possible. The other thing that happens when you do a still life, though, is you now have relationships between objects. So I put up a picture of my still life so you could see it kind of in the form that I see it at the angle I see it at from my table. So you can see the still life is there. I want you to just no matter where you're at, as you've got your still life set up, ignore your background. So like I have half of this room is my office, the other half is a storage room. So there's some funny storage, messy stuff back here. That is okay. I'm going to focus just on my objects and the space that I put up here for us to see it on. So I have my still life kind of ready to go, looking at me, and I'm looking at those objects and getting ready to cut. The first thing I want to notice is the proportion between the objects. This is a really tricky thing to get good at, but I really want you to kind of just really think about this. It's very logical. A lot of it uses math, where I'm thinking about the fractions and the proportions of something, which is kind of a unique way to look at art. We often think of art as just so fluid, but there's some really simple formulas that help us do it accurately. So we are going to take a look at the objects on our still life, and you can see that I started here. The pear is what I drew first because that's the thing in front of me and nothing overlaps it. So I usually start with something that isn't overlapped, and that's the first thing I draw because then I have a place on my page for everything. But I also need to figure out how big everything's going to be before I draw that first object. Because if I were to draw that pear this big, then that jar, in order to draw it the right size, would have to go way off the table or off the paper. And we don't want that to happen. We want the pear to fit on the still life paper, and we also want to have the jar fit on. So in order to get everything on the paper, I need to figure out the proportions. So I'm going to show you how I did that using my drawing because it's kind of tricky to actually, I was trying to get my pear up here and show you the measuring. So what I did is I took the actual pear and I looked and I measured its length by just using like a finger measuring where you use your fingers and you pinch and you say, okay, they're this far apart. And then I took them and I put them next to my jar and I said, okay, if my pear is this tall, and I start at the bottom of my jar and I go 1, 2, and a little bit more than 2, so maybe like 2 1/4. So then I knew on my page, and I'm going to flip my page and do this on a fresh paper here so you can see me do it. I knew that I needed my pear to be half the size of my jar. So I wanted to make sure my pear was small enough, and this can now change because on my paper, it just needs to relate to the other objects on my paper. It doesn't need to be exactly the size of the pear in real life. So if I choose to make the pear this big, the jar is 2 1/2 times as much as it. So it goes 1, 2, and a little bit more. But if I choose to make, and so that doesn't fill my space very well. I want to really fill up this paper. So I'm going to make my pear a little bigger. I'm going to go about this big. So that's how big my pear is going to sit here. And then I take my pear and I measure again. Okay, the jar starts here. It's 1, 2, and a little bit more, 1/4, and it goes there. So I have 1 to there. All right, so then when you think about that, I can tell where my pear goes. I can tell where my jar goes. I have the room for the bowl here. And then it looks like I'll be good to put the candles in. They might go off the edge a little bit, and I'm okay with that. So you can see that's what I've done here. Is I drew my pear and then I made sure the measurements made sense. So you can see in my pear in the picture, it's 1 is here, and then the bowl is 1, 2, and a little bit wider, so a little bit more than 2 times as wide as my pear. So once I've marked the shape of my pear is this wide, my bowl goes 1, 2, and a little bit more. So that's where the edge of my bowl goes. So I'm kind of putting these little dashes around my paper to remind myself where each thing goes. So I know the bowl fits here, the pear fits here, the jar is here, and then behind that is the candle. So these are all real light lines. You barely can notice them, but they just kind of block out your page to make sure you know where everything goes. And then one object at a time, you're going to draw the details. So now that I know where my pear goes and where my jar goes, and where my bowl goes, and where my candle tray goes, I'm going to start with the object, like I said, that's closest to me so nothing overlaps it. And I'm just going to do just like we did with those shoes and look at that individual object. And I'm going to follow its contour lines. And again, this is where I want to watch the object more closely than I watch my paper. Because if I'm really watching my object, just like we did with the shoes, we can add pretty good basic shape to everything. And then I go inside the object and I look at lines that make it more detailed. So like right here, and then this is kind of where that bottom of the pear goes, where it's got its little stem down there. And there's some light reflecting on the side here. And then we have some bruising on this pear. And I did purposely get kind of a bruised up pear out of my bowl so you could see some details on these, because then they have a little more to show. And then, so you can see how I'm finding each of those contour lines that I see on my pear here. And that kind of adds those details. So when I'm ready to paint, I know exactly how I want to do that. Then of course my pear needs its little stem. All right. And so I'm going to continue on and do each object that way where I think, and okay, I'm thinking what's right behind the pear overlaps differently. So I can go next to my jar or I could go to my bowl because neither one of them are interrupted by something else. The bowl is next to the jar, but it's not right. They don't overlap each other. And then I'd probably finish up with those candles in the back. So I'm not going to do the whole drawing. I'm going to show you the finished one, right? So I went and I drew just the same. First, I figured out those shapes. So I said, okay, how big is my pear going to be? And then I used my pear to figure out the proportions of everything else on the page so I could kind of give myself some guidelines as to where to put the objects. And once I figured out where everything goes, I measure it. Once I have them all where it goes, I can just draw each object as its own individual object because I've figured out already how big it should be in proportion to its neighbor. So I have my pear with all of its details, and I have my jar with all of its details. Then I made my bowl, and I made the different candles. So the other thing to note before I stop is that as you get going with drawing, you have in your sketchbook a page that shows some shading and value. And on that page, it also shows various forms and shapes. So something like a cylinder or a ball, or so a cylinder or a sphere or a cube, you'll see those in there. So if you're having a little tricky time, that's a great place to practice drawing some of those unusual shapes to make them look more 3D. So like you can see, especially for our cylinders, when you draw something that's a cylinder, the top is no longer a circle because we're seeing it at an angle, and the illusion makes us lay it down and make this oval shape because that's what it looks like to us in a picture. Even though if I looked at the candle from up on top, it would be circular, it actually becomes an oval to make it look 3D in something like this. So you can see that that happens on each of these objects. In order to make them look 3D, some things have different curves. You can see the top of my jar is curved up because of the angle that I'm looking at it. And these I'm looking down at, so I see the top of the candles in that way. So hopefully that helps and you're able to do this contour line drawing of still life objects. That was a really quick overview. But for those of you that aren't in class, this should hopefully help you figure out what you need to do. So by the time you get to class next time, you should have a still life drawn that has all of its contour lines, and then we'll be ready to add some color to it. Hopefully you're able to get that done. If you have any questions, you can always check with us in Seesaw.